After 10 years of complete silence, not one phone call, not one text, not one card, I opened my front door and found my father standing on the porch, smiling at me like no time had passed at all, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. I knew, before he said a single word, that the paper was a list. My father has been making lists my whole life. Lists of my failures, mostly. Lists of the ways I'd disappointed him, the choices I'd made wrong, the things a son was supposed to be that I somehow kept failing to be. And I knew, looking at that smile, a warm, easy, fatherly smile I had not seen in a decade, that the smile and the list had arrived together, in the same envelope, and that the envelope had a $sign on it. "Son," he said, like he'd seen me last week, "you look good. Can I come in? We need to talk. As a family." As a family. The man who, 10 years earlier, had stood in my mother's dining room and told me, in front of everyone, that I was no longer part of this family. That man was standing on my porch using the word like it had never left his mouth. Like he hadn't taken it away from me himself, deliberately, and kept it away for 10 years. I want to stop right here, 10 seconds into this, because I need you to understand the specific thing that happens inside a person when the people who threw you away suddenly show up smiling. It is not joy. You might think it would be joy. The reconciliation you maybe once cried for, late at night, in the early years, finally standing on your porch. It isn't joy. It's a cold, sick clarity, because you can see immediately, all the way through it, exactly why they came, and the reason is never you. The reason was never going to be you. The reason is in the folded paper in their hand. So, before I tell you what was on my father's list, and before I tell you what my wife said to him, because my wife was home that day, and her reply is the entire reason I am sitting here telling you any of this. If you have ever been discarded by the people who were supposed to love you no matter what, and then watch them come crawling back the very moment your situation changed, then stay with me, because this is a story about what that costs and what it reveals. 10 years back to the beginning of all of it. My name is Emery Castellano. I'm 35 years old, and I build and repair stringed instruments for a living. Violins, cellos, the occasional guitar, in a small shop in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm a luthier. It's an old word for an old craft, and most people have never heard it, and that's perfectly fine. What it means is that I work with my hands, and with a few hundred years of accumulated knowledge passed down from one stubborn craftsman to the next to make pieces of wood sing. It means I will never be rich doing it, and that I have never once, not for a single day, wanted to be. There is a particular kind of person who chooses to spend his whole life bent over a workbench, sanding a scroll by hand for an afternoon to get a single line right that maybe 4 people on earth will ever notice. And that person is not chasing money. He is chasing something quieter and harder to explain, and worth more to him than money ever was. I tell you that right up front because it matters to everything that comes after, especially the part where my own family decided I had married for money. I have never in my life done a single thing for money. If money had been what I wanted, I would have chosen a completely different life. I had the chance to. I turned it down. That's where this really starts. When I was 25 years old, I married a woman named Odette Onslow. Odette was 60 years old on the day we married. She is 70 now. I already know exactly what some of you are thinking, because it is exactly what my family thought, and exactly what the look on a stranger's face says in the half-second after they do the arithmetic. A 25-year-old man and a 60-year-old woman. There must be a reason. There must be an angle. And I'm not going to get defensive about it, because I understand the instinct. I'm just going to tell you the truth, the whole way through, and let the truth itself be the answer. Because the truth is this. When I married Odette, she had almost nothing to her name. There was no money, there was no fortune waiting in the wings, there was no angle for me to be playing. There was just the single most remarkable human being I have ever met in my life, and a young man who was lucky enough, and clear-eyed enough, and unconcerned enough with what other people would say to see her for exactly what she was. I met Odette when I was 23. I had just finished my training. I was barely scraping by, renting a corner of another man's workshop in exchange for sweeping his floors and doing his rough work. And to make my rent, I used to sell small repairs and cheap student-grade setups at a Saturday farmer's market downtown. Odette had a stall a few spaces down from mine. She made and sold preserves and botanical things, jams, shrubs, herbal tinctures, infused honeys, drinking vinegars, all of it from old recipes. much of it from plants she grew or foraged herself in the mountains around the city. She was 60 years old, standing at a folding table in the cold most Saturday mornings, building something out of almost nothing, and she was, without any competition at all, the most alive human being in that entire market. People came back to her stall week after week, and not only for the preserves, though the preserves were genuinely extraordinary. They came back for her. For 5 minutes with a woman who paid you complete attention, who was curious about everything, who had read every book and been everywhere in her mind, who could make you laugh and make you think harder than you had in months, all inside the same sentence. There was a line at her table that wasn't really about jam. It was about wanting to stand near that for a few minutes before you went back out into your ordinary day. I started bringing her coffee. She started saving me the broken jars she couldn't sell, because she had figured out, the way she figured out everything, that I wasn't quite eating enough. We talked for hours every Saturday in the cold between her customers and my repairs. And somewhere in there, over months, slowly and then all at once, I fell in love with her. Not despite her age. That's the part people cannot wrap their heads around, so let me say it plainly. Her age was not an obstacle I heroically overcame for love. Odette at 60 was simply the person I wanted to be near for the rest of my life. The 60 years were part of what had made her her, a feature, not a flaw. She had lived an entire enormous life by the time I met her, a hard one, and all of that living had forged her into something I had never encountered in anyone my own age, and have never encountered since. Real, bottomless depth, the kind you can only earn by living a long time and paying close attention the whole way through. It took me almost a full year to convince her that I was serious, and the reason it took so long is the reason I loved her. Because she, of all people on earth, understood better than anyone how it would look, and she did not want to become the strange, sad decision that ruined a promising young man's life. "You will resent me, Emery," she told me once, gently, not unkindly, on a cold afternoon at her stall. "Not now, but in 10 years, in 20 years. You'll wake up one day and look across the room at an old woman and you'll see, in her face, everything you gave up to be there, and I could not bear that. I would rather lose you now, while it's small, than be the thing you regret later, when it's your whole life." And I told her the truth, which was the only argument I had. I told her that the single thing I could actually imagine resenting, the one future that genuinely frightened me, was a version of my life in which I'd let her talk me out of this, out of fear of what it might look like to people who did not matter and were never going to matter. We married when I was 25 and she was 60. It was a very small ceremony in a friend's garden on a bright cold morning. Almost no one came. And that is where my family comes into the story. Because almost no one came, and the people who most pointedly, most deliberately did not come, at the very top of that short list of the absent, were mine. My family is not poor, and was always, for as long as I can remember, deeply and anxiously concerned with never appearing to be poor. My father, Conrad Castellano, had built a mid-sized regional business over 30 years, and along with it a certain amount of local standing, a name people knew, a pew at the right church, a table at the right events, and that standing mattered to him more than almost anything else in the world, more than I think any of us fully understood until it was tested. My mother, Sylvie, ran the social machinery of it all, the right clubs, the right committees, the right appearances at the right funerals and galas and openings. I have an older brother, Pierce, who slid into the family business and the family worldview without a single moment of friction or doubt, the way a key slides into the lock it was cut for. And I have an older sister, Camilla, who married precisely the sort of man my parents had always hoped one of their children would marry. And then, at the bottom, there was me. The youngest. The one who, at 19, instead of joining the business like a sensible person, announced to the family that he intended to spend his one life learning to make violins. That alone had already strained things to near breaking, years before Odette ever entered the picture. My father did not understand it, and what was worse, he did not try to understand it, and what was worse still, he took it as a kind of personal insult. A son who would choose a workbench and a leather apron over the company that bore the family name was, in his eyes, holding up a mirror to everything he'd built and calling it not enough. We had been quietly at odds, him and me, for years over the violins, but the violins in the end he could tolerate. They were eccentric, embarrassing maybe, but tolerable. Odette he could not tolerate. not for 1 second. When I told my family that I was going to marry Odette, I did it the way every important announcement in our family had always been made, at a Sunday dinner, around the long table, over my mother's good china. And I watched my father's face travel, in real time, from polite confusion to open disgust, as he slowly understood what it was that I was actually telling him. A 60-year-old woman. A woman who sold homemade jam at a farmer's market out of the back of an old hatchback. A woman with no money, no family name, no social standing, no property, none of the things, not one of the things, by which my father had measured the worth of every human being he had ever met. He did not even pretend to consider it. He didn't ask her name twice, or how we'd met, or whether she made me happy. He said, and I can give you the exact words, because they have lived inside me, word for word, for 10 years, he said, "She's too old, she's too poor, and she will never be one of us." Too old, too poor, never be one of us. My mother cried, but not, I understood even in the moment, out of any sadness for me or for my happiness. She cried out of what she actually named out loud through her tears. Embarrassment. What would people say? What would she possibly tell her friends? My brother Pierce told me, with the flat confidence of a man who had never once questioned anything, that I was throwing my entire life away on some old woman who was obviously, transparently using me, though for what exactly he could not say, since I had nothing and she had less. My sister Camilla would not look at me at all. She kept her eyes on her plate, on the good china, and said nothing, which in its own way said everything. And my father delivered the verdict the way he delivered all of his verdicts, final and cold and without appeal. If I married this woman, then I was choosing her over my family, and I would no longer have a family to be chosen against. I would be out, disowned, cut off, done. I sat there and I looked around that table at the four of them, at the faces of the people who were supposed to love me with no conditions, no terms, no fine print at the bottom of the page, and I understood, fully and finely, something I had somehow managed not to know for 25 years, that their love had always had conditions, that it had simply never once been tested, because I had never before given them a reason to enforce the terms. And so I made my choice, right there at the table. I told them, quietly, that I was sorry they felt the way they did. I told them that I loved Odette. I told them that I was going to marry her, on the date we'd set, with or without them. And then I stood up from that table, and I walked out, and the heavy front door of my parents' house closed behind me with a sound I can still hear. And then there was silence. For 10 years. I need you to understand the sheer completeness of it, because the completeness is the part that did the real, lasting damage, far more than the disowning itself ever did. It was not a cooling-off period. It was not a stretch of awkward, tense holidays where we all pretended. It was total, and it was deliberate, and it was maintained with a discipline that I almost have to respect. Not one single phone call, not one text message, not one birthday card, not one Christmas card, not one line of acknowledgement in 10 full years. And I want to be honest with you about the early part of it because I'm not too proud anymore to tell you how it actually went. I reached out. For the first couple of years, I reached out, more than once, more than I probably should have. I called my mother 3 or 4 times, on her birthday, around the holidays. Every call went straight to her voicemail, and not one of them was ever returned. I heard, secondhand, through an old mutual acquaintance, that my sister Camilla had a baby, a little girl, my niece, a child who is now 9 years old and whom I have never met, will likely never meet, who does not know that I exist. I sent a card when I heard. A card with a careful, gentle, hopeful note inside it. Nothing came back. Not even a returned envelope. Just nothing. The way a stone dropped down a very deep well never makes a sound you can hear. I emailed my brother Pierce one time, a couple of years in, just a few lines, just to say that I was still here, that I was well, that the door was open on my end any time any of them ever wanted to walk back through it. He never replied. He read it. I knew he read it, and he chose, the way they had all chosen, to say nothing at all. And after about 2 years of that, I stopped. Not out of bitterness exactly, though I'd be lying if I said there was none in it. Mostly, I stopped out of a slow, settling understanding that they had meant it, that this was not a bluff or a punishment with an expiration date. That to my family, I really was gone, erased, a chapter closed and the book shut. And a man can only knock on a locked door so many times before he accepts that the people inside have heard every knock and have chosen, every single time, not to answer. So I stopped knocking. And I built a life instead with the one person who had wanted me. And here's the thing that my family never knew, because they had chosen not to be there to see any of it. It was a good life. A genuinely, deeply, quietly, extraordinary life. A far better one, by every measure that I have come to believe actually counts, than the life I would have had if I'd stayed in my assigned seat at that long table. Odette and I had almost nothing when we married, and for the first several years, that did not change. We were happy, and we were broke, and the two facts sat side by side without any contradiction at all. I built instruments in my borrowed corner of that shared shop, and I slowly, repair by repair and referral by referral, built a real reputation as someone whose work you could trust. Odette kept working her stall, kept making her preserves in our tiny kitchen, kept rising before dawn. And somewhere in there, 3 or 4 years into our marriage, something began to happen with Odette's little business. It started small, the way these things do. A good local restaurant began buying her shrubs to build cocktails around, and one of those cocktails got written up, and suddenly there were people seeking her out by name. Then a well-known specialty grocer wanted to carry her preserves. And Odette, who had been quietly making this stuff by hand at a folding table for years, asking nothing, expecting nothing, turned out to have something a great deal rarer than good recipes. She had a genuine, unteachable gift. A palate and an instinct of a kind you simply cannot train into a person, married to 60-some years of knowing, with absolute certainty, exactly who she was and exactly what she made, and exactly what she would never, under any circumstances, compromise. She would not cut a corner. She would not cheapen an ingredient to widen a margin. And that refusal, it turned out, was the entire secret. In a world drowning in things made as cheap and as fast as possible, here was a woman in her 60s making things the slow way, the right way, the real way, and people could taste the difference, and they were starving for it without even knowing they were. I want to be very clear about what this was and was not, because it matters to the believability of everything after. This was not an overnight lottery. There was no magic check, no single windfall. This was a woman building a real business, slowly, brick by patient brick, over the better part of a decade, during the exact years when nearly everyone else her age was retiring. And I was beside her for every step of it. I kept the books at the kitchen table at night after my own day in the shop. I built her first shelving and displays with my own hands. I drove the delivery van when she expanded past what one person could carry. I did the 1,000 small, invisible things, year after year, while still running my own shop by day. We poured those years into it together, the two of us. And the company grew, slowly first, then steadily. Then, in the way these things sometimes go once they cross some invisible threshold, very quickly, from a market stall to a regional brand, from a regional brand to a national one, on the shelves of real stores in real cities. Investors came calling, and Odette, every bit as sharp at 68 as she'd been at 60, made good decisions, and a few genuinely brilliant ones. And about 10 years into our marriage, a much larger company moved to acquire Odette's business outright, and the deal they put on the table valued the thing that my 70-year-old wife had built from a folding table at a farmer's market, from cracked jars she used to quietly press into the hands of a hungry young instrument maker, at $38 million. $38 million. I'm not going to pretend that a number like that doesn't change some practical things in a person's life. Of course it did, but I want to tell you more than anything what it did not change, because this is the part that the rest of the story turns on. It did not change us. We did not move into some glass mansion on a hill. We did not become different people wearing different clothes in a different life. We still live, to this day, in the same modest house we had bought together years before, on the same ordinary street. I still get up every single morning and go to my shop and build instruments with my hands, because that is who I am, and that is what I love. And $38 million does not, it turns out, make a man stop loving the one thing he was put on this earth to do. Odette still rises at dawn and goes out to tend her garden. The money mostly just sat there, a strange and quiet fact in the background of a life that the two of us already liked exactly as it was. We gave a great deal of it away, quietly, with no names attached, to things and people we cared about. If anything, the truth is, we were a little embarrassed by it. But here's the thing about a number like $38 million. It does not stay quiet, no matter how quiet you try to keep it. An acquisition like that gets written about. There was a piece in a business publication, the dry kind, and then, worse, a warm human interest version of the same story in a regional paper. The genuinely lovely tale of a woman in her 70s who had built an entire empire from a single market stall, complete with a charming little detail near the end about her devoted younger husband, the violin maker, who had believed in her from the very beginning, back when she had nothing. And somewhere, someone in my family read that article. I know, almost to the day when they read it, because exactly 9 days after that regional piece ran, after 10 full years of total, deliberate, unbroken silence, my phone rang one evening. And the name that lit up the screen was a name I had not seen appear on my phone in a decade. Dad. I didn't answer it. I sat in my chair, and I looked at the screen and I let it ring all the way through until it stopped. He did not leave a message. But 3 days later, he did not need to call again. Because 3 days later, on an ordinary afternoon, there he was, standing on my front porch, smiling, with a folded piece of paper in his hand. I let him in. And I want to tell you why, because I suspect part of you is yelling at the screen for me to have slammed the door, but I let him in, and given the chance I would do it again. I let him in because I'm not my father, and I did not want to become him, even for the satisfaction of one slammed door. Because some stubborn part of me wanted to look the whole thing in the face rather than slam a door and spend the rest of my life wondering. And because Odette was home, just there in the kitchen, and I knew that whatever was about to unfold, I wanted to handle it as the man my wife had married, and not as the man who had raised me. He came in, and he looked slowly around our modest living room, and I watched him do it. I watched the calculation move across his face, the small, involuntary flicker of disappointment that the house was not grander than it was, that the $38 million had not been spent on anything he could see and admire, followed almost instantly by the recovery, by the private reminder to himself that the money was there regardless, humble house or not. He sat down on my couch, and he made small talk so grotesque in its easy casualness that I could barely breathe through it. 10 years of engineered silence papered over in an afternoon with, "The place looks real nice, son," and, "So you're keeping busy out in the shop?" As though he had merely been away on a long trip, as though no door had ever closed, as though he had not personally erased me from his life for a decade and only now, with 38 million reasons, troubled himself to redraw me back in. And then, at last, he got to it. He unfolded the paper. I'm not going to give you the whole list, item by item, because it was long, genuinely long, and reading it all aloud would only drain what little dignity remains in this part of the story. But I will give you its shape. My father had arrived with what he called a set of proposals. Ways, he said, for the family to come back together, to heal, to move forward, and every single proposal on that page had a number attached to it. There was a proposal that the family business, Conrad and Pierce's business, which had apparently fallen on some genuinely hard years that I, of course, had known nothing about, could use a significant investment, and that family, after all, ought to support family in difficult times. There was a thoughtful suggestion that a man in my fortunate new position would surely want to help his nieces and nephews with the cost of their education, those same children, of course, that I had never once been permitted to meet. There was, and I want you to sit with the gall of this one, an entire passage about how they had always known I was special, always believed in me deep down, and how the whole painful matter of the disowning had really just been a misunderstanding, a single heated moment around a dinner table, nothing that loving people couldn't move past. 10 years of cold, deliberate silence, every unreturned call and unanswered card, all of it recast in an afternoon as a misunderstanding, now that there were 38 million reasons to misunderstand it differently. And then, at the very bottom of the list was the final item. And the final item was different from all the others, and my father had saved it for last on purpose because he knew exactly how different it was, because the man is a salesman to the marrow of his bones, and he knew it was the strongest card in his hand. My mother was sick. She needed surgery, a serious one, a real one, something with her heart. It was expensive, and it was urgent, time-sensitive, and the family, in its hard years, was apparently struggling to find a way to cover the cost of it. And my father looked up at me from the paper, and for the first time since he had walked through my door, the salesman's easy smile faltered and slipped, and underneath it for just a moment was something that might actually have been real fear, and he said, Your mother needs this, Emery. Whatever's gone on between you and me, she is still your mother. You wouldn't let her." And he stopped, and he did not finish the sentence. He let it hang there in my living room, unfinished, because he understood that the unfinished version was more powerful than any way he could have ended it. And I have to be honest with you about what that did to me, sitting there on the other side of my own coffee table, because this is the entire knot of the thing. Everything else on that list I could have refused without a flicker of hesitation. Greed is easy to refuse. Greed practically refuses itself. But my mother, my actual mother, possibly dying for the lack of a surgery that I could now, with a single phone call, easily afford to pay for, that is not easy to refuse. That is, in fact, the single cruelest thing it is possible to be asked by people who have thrown you away, because it takes the one genuinely decent and uncorrupted thing still left inside you, your love for your sick mother, and it turns that decency into a weapon and points it directly back at your own chest. They had found the exact pressure point, the one place I could not defend, refuse, and I was a monster, a bitter and hard-hearted man who let his own mother die over an old grudge. Agree, and I had let them use my dying mother's body as the lever to pry open my wallet and my whole life, and worse, I had taught them, confirmed for them, that the disowning had worked exactly as designed, that they could throw a son in the garbage and then reach in and reclaim him, clean and useful, the very instant it became profitable to do so. There was no clean answer. There was no good way through it. They had built it, deliberately, so that there wouldn't be. I sat there in my own living room, genuinely, completely not knowing what I was about to say. And that is the moment when Odette came in from the kitchen. She had heard. Of course she had heard. The house is not big, and there is no door between the kitchen and the living room. She came in quietly, drying her hands on a dish towel, this small, straight-backed, white-haired woman of 70, and my father stood up off my couch out of some old reflex of manners, and then he plainly did not know what to do with himself, because here she was at last, the woman he had called too old and too poor, and not one of us, the woman he had erased a son over without ever once troubling himself to meet her. Here she was in the flesh, standing in the middle of the home she had built, holding a dish towel, looking back at him with the calmest, steadiest pair of eyes you have ever seen in your life. "Mr. Castellano," she said, "not Conrad, not Dad, Mr. Castellano. I haven't had the pleasure in 10 years somehow. There was no venom anywhere in it. And that is the thing I most need you to understand about Odette. The thing that made what came next so devastating. There was no venom anywhere in her, not a drop of it. There was only a clear, level, perfect accuracy that was somehow far worse than any venom could ever have been, precisely because you could not dismiss it. You could not wave it away as the bitterness of a wronged woman, or the spite of someone settling a score. It was simply, unanswerably true, and being true, it left him nowhere to stand. My father started to say something, some reflexive pleasantry, and Odette raised one hand, gently, just slightly, and he stopped. "I heard the list," she said. "All of it, from the kitchen. And I am going to answer it, if that's all right with everyone, because most of it is about my money, and because Emery is far too kind a man to say the things that need saying here, and because I am 70 years old, and I no longer have any time at all to waste on being anything other than perfectly direct." She sat down in the chair across from him. I sat down too, and here is what my wife said, and I want to tell you that I have never in my entire life, before or since, been more proud of another human being than I was in the next 2 minutes. The investment in the family business, no. The money to prop up the company, no. The education funds, the allowances, the help getting back on your feet, no. All of it, no. And I want to be very clear with you about why, so that you don't walk out of here and tell yourself some more comfortable story about it on the drive home. It is not revenge. I am 70 years old, Mr. Castellano. I have buried a great many people I loved, and I have learned that life is far too short and far too precious to spend even an hour of it on revenge. So, this is not that. It is much simpler than that. It is only this. You do not get to disown a man, completely and deliberately for 10 years, and then send his own father to my door to collect against his wife's success. That is not how any of this works. Not in my house. Emery is not an investment of yours that finally matured. He is not an account you opened long ago and can simply come back and draw against now that the balance has gotten interesting. He is a person. a person you threw away, on purpose, with both hands. And you do not get to throw away a person the very moment he becomes useful to you again. My father's face was doing something I had truly never seen it do in 35 years. He was not a man who was accustomed to being spoken to in this way. And he was certainly not accustomed to being spoken to in this way by a woman he had dismissed, sight unseen, with 3 words, a full decade ago. But, Odette said. And then her voice changed. It went softer, lower, and somehow that softening made everyone in the room lean in toward her. But there is the matter of your wife. Sylvie, Emery's mother. She was quiet for a moment. I will pay for the surgery, she said simply. In full. Whatever it costs, however much it is. Today, if the hospital will let me. I looked at her. My father looked at her. I do not think either one of us had seen it coming. And I am going to tell you exactly why, Odette continued, because the why is the entire point of it, and I need you to actually hear me. I am not paying for it to buy my way into your good graces, because I promise you, Mr. Castellano, I have no desire whatsoever to be in your good graces. I am not paying for it because you asked, or because you cleverly saved it for the bottom of your list where you thought it would do the most work. I am paying for it for one reason and one reason only. Because a woman is sick and she may die, and I happen to have the means to prevent that from happening, and I am simply not the kind of person who lets a woman die in order to win an argument. That is all. That is the whole of it. Your son's mother is going to get her surgery because true decency does not first stop to check whether a person has earned it. That is the entire thing that decency is. And then she said the thing that landed, the thing I will hear in my head, in her steady voice, for the rest of my life. You told your son, 10 years ago at your dinner table, that I was too poor and too low to ever be one of you. And now, here we all are. Your family needs help that it cannot give itself, and the person sitting here able to provide that help is the woman who sold jam at a market table. The woman who wasn't good enough to be one of you. I am not pointing that out to gloat, Mr. Castellano. I genuinely am not. I am pointing it out because I have come to believe, in the last few minutes, that you honestly do not understand what wealth actually is, and that this misunderstanding has already cost you your son, and that you ought to understand it finally before you leave my house tonight. Wealth was never the number in my bank account. I was a wealthy woman when I had nothing in the world but cracked jars and a folding table in the cold, because I knew how to love a person for who he was, rather than for what he could do for me. That is the only wealth that has ever actually mattered. And you had a fortune of it. You had a son who is, without exaggeration, the finest man I have ever known. And you took that fortune and you threw it in the garbage because he embarrassed you in front of your friends. So please, do not come into my home and sit on my couch and lecture anyone here about who is too poor to belong. By the only measure that has ever once mattered, you are the single poorest man I have ever met in my life. The room was completely, perfectly silent. The surgery will be paid directly to the hospital, Odette said, rising to her feet now, gentle again, back to the plain business of it. Have them send the billing information to me, and I will take care of it the same day. The money will go to them, not to you, not through you, not near you, and it will go for one purpose only, which is Sylvie's care and Sylvie's recovery, and that is the beginning and the end of everything that is on offer in this house tonight. Not because we are cruel people, we are not, but because we are clear ones. Now, I think it is time for you to go home, Mr. Castellano, and please give my sincere regards to your wife. I mean that. I truly hope she heals completely and quickly, and my father, Conrad Castellano, who had never once in my entire life been at a loss for a verdict, who had always had the final word in every room he had ever stood in, rose to his feet and opened his mouth and closed it again and had nothing, not one thing, no item left on the list, no pitch left to make, no verdict left to hand down. He looked at me, just once, and I think for a single unguarded second the salesman fell all the way off of him, and what was left underneath was just a tired old man who had been shown, with perfect clarity and not 1 ounce of cruelty, exactly what he had done, and exactly what it had cost him, and exactly how little of it he could ever undo. And then he left. He walked out of my front door, the same man who had closed his own front door behind me 10 years before, except that this time He was the one walking out into the dark, and I was the one who got to stay inside in my warm and modest home with my wife. I am going to tell you how it ended, because the ending is the part that matters the most. We paid for my mother's surgery, directly to the hospital, exactly as Odette had said we would. It went well. My mother came through it, and she recovered. And I know that she recovered with certainty, because some months later, my mother did a thing that my father has still never done. She called me, and she did not have a list in her hand. She called to say, "Thank you." And then she cried for a long time on the phone. And then she said the thing I had been waiting 10 years to hear from a single member of that family. The thing I had honestly stopped believing I would ever hear, and it was very simple. She said, "I'm sorry. We were wrong. I was wrong." She told me that she had been ashamed of it for years, quietly, privately ashamed, and too weak and too frightened to ever act on the shame, that she had let my father set the terms of the silence the same way she had let him set the terms of everything else in their life together for 40 years. And she told me that lying in a hospital bed, alive, breathing, because of the unhesitating generosity of the very woman she had helped to cast out of the family, had finally broken something open inside her that needed breaking. We talk now, my mother and I, carefully and not often, and with a great deal still unsaid between us. It is not what it once was, and it never will be again, and we both know that. But it is real, and it is hers. She came back to me with no number attached to her, asking for nothing, and that, in the end, was the only way back that was ever going to count for anything. My father, I have not spoken to since that afternoon. I genuinely do not know whether I ever will, and I have made my peace with that, more peace than I would have believed possible. Some doors, once you finally understand precisely why they were closed against you, you simply stop wishing would open again. My brother Pierce and my sister Camilla both stayed on my father's side of the whole thing. They had come, in the end, for the money, and not for me. And the moment it became clear that the money was not coming, neither, ever again, did they. That used to genuinely hurt, in the early months after. It mostly doesn't anymore. It turns out that you cannot really lose a thing that was never actually there to begin with. And Odette and I are exactly where we have always been, which is to say, happy. Deeply, quietly happy. She is 70 now, and I am 35, and the arithmetic that scandalizes every stranger who does it still does not trouble either of us for a single second. I know full well what the years ahead are likely to hold. I am not a naive man, and I never was. To love a person who is 35 years older than you is to sign up, knowingly and in advance, for a particular and certain kind of grief somewhere down the road. And I signed up for it with my eyes wide open, gladly, without hesitation, because a smaller, safer love, the kind that costs you nothing and risks nothing and asks nothing of you, was never once a thing worth wanting in the first place. Every single ordinary day that I get to have with her is a day I would have been an unforgivable fool to have traded away for the approval of people who could only ever see her as a number of dollars and a number of years, and who missed, entirely and forever, the whole astonishing person standing right there in front of them the whole time. She still makes her preserves. Not for money anymore, for us, for friends, for the people we love, for the simple joy of the doing of it. There is a jar of her shrub sitting on my workbench right now, this evening, beside a 100-year-old violin I am slowly bringing back to life. And sometimes, in the evenings when the work is winding down, she comes out to the shop and settles into the old armchair in the corner with a book, and she reads while I work, and the light through the windows goes slowly gold, and I find myself thinking back to that long table, and that Sunday dinner 10 years ago, and to the cold final verdict my father handed down over the good china, too old, too poor, never be one of us, and I think to myself, he was right about exactly one thing in the end. She never did become one of them. Thank God for that. She was always so very much more than that. Let me leave you with one question tonight, and I really do read these, every single one of them, so please, tell me. Have you ever been thrown away by people who were supposed to love you no matter what? And then watch those same people try to come back into your life the very moment you had something that they wanted? What did you do when they came back? Did you let them in? Or had you finally learned, by then, exactly what their love had been worth all along? I would genuinely, truly like to know. Because here is the thing this whole long ordeal taught me, all the way down to the bone. The people who measure your worth by what you can do for them will always, eventually, in the end, show you exactly who they really are. And the only thing required of you is to be paying close enough attention to believe them when they finally do. And if this story meant something to you, even a little, do me one small kindness before you go tonight. Leave a comment down below, even just a single word, so that I know you stayed all the way through to the end with us. And subscribe so that the next story can find its way to you when it comes. Because they do keep coming. And every once in a while, the person that everyone counted out and wrote off and threw away turns out to be the richest one in the whole room, in the only way that was ever worth counting.